Hey everybody, I'm Vince. Welcome to the channel. I like to take books that I think you should know about and summarize them for you. Today, the book you should know about is called Man's Search for Himself by Rollo May. Now, this title is very much like a book that I had done earlier called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, and they deal with very similar issues. In some ways are very similar, in some ways are very different. But anyway, if you're looking for that one, search my channel for Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. This is Man's Search for Himself by Rollo May. All right, I'm going to try to summarize this for you in under 5 minutes. So let's see how it goes. The problem, according to May, that he's trying to figure out or he's trying to solve is that people have lost their authentic selves. He says what that looks like is, what that looks like on the ground in therapy is that people are complaining of loneliness and anxiety and feelings of hopelessness or a loss of a sense of who they are. He says that people have put too much emphasis on being one of the group or conforming to society standards. And they've done this at the expense of themselves, so that now they have this feeling of hollowness or emptiness inside. We are overcome with uncontrollable anxiety. And I say uncontrollable there because, to May, anxiety can be a good thing because it can help us grow and discover who we are. But when we don't have a good foundation of ourselves, we can't overcome our anxiety. We have nothing to ground ourselves in. Anxiety can be caused by limited knowledge of the future, of our realization of our own mortality, like that we're going to die someday. And he's writing this book not too many years after the development of the atomic bomb. So you can imagine how people at the time were very anxious about the future. Of course, it might also include economic uncertainty, health, and similar things. But for my money, it's probably the atomic bomb that they're worried about. By the way, interestingly, coming right off of the heels of World War II, he talks about how a lack of self and our inability to control our anxiety as what leads to totalitarian regimes like Nazism. So basically, it works like this. When we don't have a good foundation of who we are or a good sense of who we are, we give ourselves over to seeking to be what others want us to be or who the government tells us to be. And interestingly, by giving into that, in order to get rid of our anxiety, we also have to give up our freedom to be our authentic selves. And when that's done, according to May, the lack of freedom produces hate. And this is why regimes like the Nazi regime had to give everyone someone to hate. So in their case, it was the Jews. And I found that particularly interesting because, as May says, this is a tendency of totalitarian governments to give its followers some kind of scapegoat. Why you suffer is because of those people, right? And then, like, we'll help you get over those suffering because we hate those people also. And that's just how totalitarian governments work, and that's all because of the anxiety that people feel, and they sacrifice their freedom in order to stop having that anxiety. Okay, so if the problem is this lack of self-awareness, what's the solution? May says the goal for every human being is to become a person. Every organism has one and only one central need in life to fulfill its own potentialities. What he means by this is that we don't just play the roles that society gives us, but we become who we are. By fulfilling our own potentialities, he means that each person has inherent qualities or capabilities or interests that are particular to them. And so we need to find those and gear our lives toward them. This means that we need not only to overcome what we feel society wants us to be, but we also have to overcome what our parents want us to be, or in fact, anything that we are dependent on. And as we become more and more independent, we discover ourselves more and more. Self-awareness is linked to freedom. Freedom is, in his words, man's capacity to take a hand in his own development. He says the more self-aware a person is, the more free that person is. In this sense, he's talking about Sartre's concept of freedom. So if you don't know who Sartre is, Sartre was a French existentialist philosopher, and he one time said something like, we were never so free as when we were under German occupation. And what he meant by that was, we were constantly reminded at that time that our lives were in our hands. At any moment, we could revolt. It might mean death, but we could still do it. And so not only have we found something to live for, but we've found something to die for. And to May, that's very important because once we realize that we could choose to die, that means we also choose to live. Once we do that, we have to accept responsibility for our lives. Life is not a burden, it's now seen as a choice. So in short, The answer to the problem of emptiness and overwhelming anxiety is to discover who we are apart from others, finding in ourselves something that we want to live for. He says once we do that, we're able to cope with uncertainty and external things because we are certain about internal things, what's important. He says we're able to love others because we're able to meet others as a whole person and not just try to mirror what we see in them or seek dependency. And we're able to find joy in our lives because we live them to the fullest. Okay, I'll have to look later and see if I reached my 5-minute goal or not. So that's the 5-minute summary, but I did want to spend a little bit more time on why I think this was a book you should know about. And there's a few reasons. The first reason is I actually knew about this book because it was recommended to me after my divorce. And so I tend to look at it in terms of relationship. I think a common misconception about relationships and marriage is that we were all born as like half a person and that we're looking for our soulmate. Like God created us as one and He split us in two and put us on earth, and now we have to look around and find the other half. I think of the movie Jerry Maguire where the famous line where he tells the woman, "You complete me." And all the people start crying, right? And when looked at through the lens of this book, we can see that's the big problem with this. By not knowing ourselves first, we end up changing ourselves or becoming dependent on the other person to fill that some kind of void in our lives. Of course, they can't because the void is self-awareness. Others can't fill the void of ourselves in our own lives. To May, while we are scared of loneliness, that's exactly what we need, though. That is, we have to find ourselves and love ourselves before we can love others. So that in a relationship, it should be made of not two halves that make a whole person, but two complete people who love to be around each other. A second reason I thought this would be a good book to introduce is because I did a previous video on a book called Black Theology and Black Power by James Cone. You can find a summary on my channel, by the way. At one point, Cone talks about the Christian message and minorities. And he says something like, what the gospel message does is it liberates the black person to be free of being less than a person, like he's seen through the eyes of the majority. He says that this is what Paul means when Paul says, it is for freedom that Christ sets you free. So May here sees that that's exactly what all people need in order to realize themselves, or what he calls realize their potentialities. They need to discover their own freedom. And to Cone, this is the big problem with race relations. It's that the majority culture doesn't allow the minority culture to be free. Instead, they want them to become one of us. You're free to conform to the culture. And then you think back to May. May says conforming to culture is the big problem. In fact, he says, if people keep trying to conform to the culture and meet societal expectations, you're soon going to have a lot of societal unrest. And that's exactly what we have with race relations, right? So May was not writing about race relations, but we can certainly see how these two books can complement one another. So I thought there was a nice correlation here that can be made for unity, not just in race relations, but between all humans. We need not only to find ourselves, but to give others the freedom to find themselves too. In short, we need to treat everyone with equality and dignity. So anyway, there's a lot more reasons I thought this was a good book to know about, but I will mention one last one, and that is I thought it was interesting his views on totalitarianism. If we look at our political parties in America, isn't it odd that every Republican agrees with every decision that every other Republican agrees with? You know, and the same is true for Democrats. Now, that's an exaggeration, especially more and more recently. For instance, Donald Trump really divided the Republican Party, but people who support Trump feel the need to morally justify everything about him, and the same can be said of other political leaders. You know, I just picked Trump because I think everyone would agree that his followers are more dogmatic, at least a little more dogmatic than the rest seem to be. Trump himself even said that he could shoot someone in the middle of the street and he wouldn't lose a single follower, right? But my point is, very few of us vote for a political candidate. We more often vote against the candidate that we don't like. And then we let our political candidates guide our ethics. May would say that this is because we have not fully got to know ourselves, but instead let our politics define who we are. And they keep us tied to them because they make us afraid to look away. I'm not saying I know what the answer is, and I wonder if we could ever, get ourselves out of the mess we got ourselves into. But I think it's worth thinking about how much of our lives are run by fear and how much of that fear is generated by the political parties on purpose in order to gain our loyalty and trust. Okay, so there you have it. That's my 5-minute summary on Rollo May's Man's Search for Himself and a couple of my own thoughts. So